Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, brought to you by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm with my co-host, Brian Tankersley, in his home office in Knoxville, Tennessee. And something that we want to talk with you about today that is super important for this year is Model Context Protocol, or MCP. Now, we had this in various episodes in late 2025, and it is a significant trend. Now, an MCP is a standardized connector that lets AI tools securely talk to business systems, typically accounting software, without any custom integrations for each of the apps. So you can think of an MCP like a universal adapter. Instead of plugging in a different cable into every system, MCP lets you use one cable. Some people have been saying USBs is an example of this, but in a separate accounting technology lab, we were fortunate to have Stephen Edgington talk about Dext, and he actually thought it was more accurate to talk about Bluetooth, which is a little more janky.
It's much less reliable. You have to fidget with it sometimes. I mean, on my iPhone in particular, the Bluetooth is a challenge.
Yeah. So the MCP matters to accounting users in several ways. First, consistency. It's one standard way for an AI to interact with accounting data. This really, in my mind, for most of you, is going to replace API access. Two, it's security. The access is permission-based and auditable. Three is control. Your firm can decide what the data the AI can see or act on. And it really is a practical AI. It enables real tests, drafting reconciliations, explaining variances, summarizing transactions without exporting data to spreadsheets. Now, MCP is not several things too. It's not a replacement for your accounting system. It's not an AI that thinks on its own, and it's not an uncontrolled data feed. So the MCP, you can almost think as kind of a magic layer to allow you to talk to not only one system, but multiple systems at the same time. And the day before we did the recording, we were working with a colleague on MCPs, and we had many different interfaces set up at the same time. One demonstration in particular, we had 4 different systems, and we're going back and forth between all 4. And all 4 systems were recognized by the MCP query. Now, does it always get it right? No. So maybe I think, Brian, I can see you were just going to step in on that.
I was just going to say that it's very much like back in the good old days before everything was as automated as it is today. When you needed to do a big analysis project, for example, like you're doing M&A or something like that, you had to go talk to 5 or 6 different people and interrogate them to get the information you needed to do that work. And this is an MCP is very much like this machine to machine conversation that you used to have in person to get the information you needed, whether it was, I need you to write a query, get this out of this database, and then put this into a text file. And then you're going to need to transform it into this format. And then we need to get this in a database. We need to get this additional table in this database and this other information so that we can compare these 2 data sets together and figure out what the overlaps are and what the other, find the exceptions. As we think about this MCP tool really is very much like it's asking the questions that you need to ask of the databases and of the data sources to get it. Now, it may ask them in the wrong order. It may not get the data structure exactly right. It's going to make mistakes. So it is going to be kind of clunky, but it is a vast improvement over having to do all the stuff manually yourself. And it will actually solve a lot of many problems, let's say 60% of problems in the background automatically.
Yeah, so I'll probably ask you to also listen into the Dext discussion with Steve, because Stephen was very factual about things. But I thought you were going to have a cow, Brian, when he was talking about going to the gym and exercising, but you were just like function at the bit saying, yeah, I'm thinking, no, I don't want to go to the gym and work
Well,
out.
but the thing about it is, there is a good analogy in that, if you're going to master a musical instrument, if you're going to get better at any kind of anything that requires skill, like my son's learned how to do machining and welding, and I've worked with wood for decades, and and again, I've learned. I used to teach people how to weld, and so it's a as we're thinking about this thing, I know that you have to work at something to get better at it. Okay. I've never felt it was important enough for me to spend an hour every day doing a repetitive walking motion on a treadmill to make my life more complete. But that doesn't mean that I don't understand that you do have to work at things to get better at it.
Well, it's the old 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah.
And one of the things that in our work time here over the last few days, frankly, we ran into the new C2 term, which basically says that C2 means that you speak like a native speaker in the language. And that takes about 1,000 hours of training. And there's that old 10,000 hour rule that was out there about becoming a master.
Yeah.
Well, we're not asking you to become a master, but we know you're going to have to do a little bit of work in the gym, a little bit of physical training on these MCPs.
You're going to have to try and fail at these things. Okay. And as you fail, you will learn things that will make you successful.
But we're going to try to get you through some of the fundamentals today. And for setting up a general MCP flow, there's really 5 steps that applies pretty much to all platforms. First, you have to choose some sort of an MCP-enabled AI tool. Now, you can select an AI platform that supports MCP connections, or you can use vendor-provided MCP connectors. And we were looking at libraries in the last 24 hours of various MCP pre-written interfaces, which were fascinating, and various platforms that can be used. Then number 2, you have to define the scope and permissions. So you have to decide, is it read only or is it read write? And, if you think about general ledger and AR and AP and payroll, for most of you, you're probably going to be far more interested in read only. And through the years, as we've taught ODBC, for example, we talked about read only type of authentication, and very few of the interfaces we actually are allowed to write back. Budgeting in particular, we talked about that for years and years. Number 3, you're going to have a way to authenticate securely. So whether you're using OAuth or a token-based access, you need some sort of an authentication. You shouldn't be using passwords to make these connections because those would be imminently hackable. Number 4 is you want to test your setup with non-production data. You want to run basic queries like summarize last month's expenses before you turn it out in the wild for broader use with your team. And number 5, you want to set your governance. You want to document, and you need to update your policies. And most of you listening have a written information security plan to comply with 5293, 5447. And frankly, this is going to take an update as I'd see it. I would expect it to be mandated within this year, but we'll see how that comes out. But also other things like your AI usage policies, your vendor access logs, and other items have to be done as well. So that you can select MCPs for lots of different platforms. So before we decided to record this session for you, I did the research on MCPs for common platforms. So we looked at an MCP for Xero and an MCP for Zoho Books and an MCP for QuickBooks Online. And all of those were available, including MCPs for many other systems, including productivity systems like Outlook, as an example. So what I'd like you to begin to picture here is MCP is kind of this Swiss Army knife of connecting everything to everything. It overlays a system so we can ask things about it with AI. Now, when it comes to these governance recommendations, it's pretty clear in my mind, starting with read only is a wise thing to do here.
Yeah.
These systems are good enough that they can write data back. And the last thing we did before we went to dinner yesterday was write something back. And it was pretty stunning how easy it was to read in the original and write the new updated things back that have been created by the AI.
But imagine how much of a disaster it could be if it didn't write accurately and it actually wrote a few thousand records back and you then had to manually go fix them. I mean, that's the thing about writing back to data is that you do it at your peril, unless you're positive that it's going to work right and it's been adequately tested, you just don't do it.
Yeah, I think another major thing, and many firms are dealing with this, Brian. In fact, I answered 3 questions in the last 24 hours on this topic alone. Client consent. What do we do with client-centric data? And we've been on a bit of a tear in the last 12 months on many of these AI systems that are taking great liberties with client data. So you're probably for MCPs actually going to have to update engagement letters and other AI disclosures. One of the fascinating turns this year that you and I talked about in the last few weeks was the AI CPA's Engage conference, where we're both scheduled to speak, that they updated their engagement letter where it has a clause that none of the content that's presented can be developed on anything with AI. And I read that very carefully because it's like, AI images seem pretty benign.
Spell check is AI.
And,
Grammar check is AI.
but the document says no AI usage. So you and I are actually going to be kind of scoping things out and saying, that looks like AI. So you need to watch your audit trails as well. So ensure that your MCP activity is logged and reviewable. You're going to have to do even more vendor due diligence than before. We have talked about that in prior accounting technology labs, but you've got to confirm data retention and the training use and the sub-processors, all topics that we've talked about in prior labs. Also, make sure that you got your policy right. So we're super excited about MCPs. Why? It makes AI practical and more flexible, and it gives you capabilities that you've just never had before. So now, I guess we could also go down into deeper into tools, but Brian, what other things do you think our users need to know about MCPs? I'm just going to predict MCPs are in your future, but I'll
Yeah,
turn you
I
from
think
there.
they're definitely in your future because that's how you're going to get the data out of your systems of record and into the AI engines so that it can be used to come up with conclusions for advisory and to identify anomalies and to find fraud and do all kinds of other things like that. The challenge, of course, is going to be, again, just like everything with AI, making it reliable and working with it. And by the way, you're not just going to have one MCP hooked up. You may have, like we did yesterday, 4 MCPs hooked up to 4 different systems that are all passing data back and forth, almost like a weird card game, where this data is just flowing all over the place in response to all these questions to solve this bigger problem.
Yeah,
So
and at the risk of interrupting you, Brian, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask Stephen when we were interviewing him. Explain how you do an MCP between Zero and Dext and Bill and, because I was going through 4 or 5 different systems, many of which they interface with, but it's like if you had an MCP for each of those systems and then could make a query, explain how this receipt
yeah, this
is
receipt,
logged.
here's this receipt. Is this receipt a duplicate of anything in the ERP system? Is it a duplicate of anything that is indexed that hasn't been posted yet? Has it been turned in on an expense report in Expensify or Zoho Expense or some other application like that? There are things like that in fraud detection and in everything else where we want it to be recorded once and exactly once. And so those kinds of things are going to require more sophisticated MCPs. And that's one of the reasons why we think you ought to be experimenting with some of these things and trying to get your hands a little bit dirty because you're going to learn things working with them. And it's going to take a while for you to become an expert and for you to be able to create information that where you're satisfied, and you should be satisfied at that point. You should have a level of expertise where before you become satisfied, that basically says that that this is reliable information and it is accurate. So you're going to have to try and fail and, check things 15 different ways. And then you're going to be able to trust it after that point. But it's an investment of time, just like when you learned how to use Windows and how to switch from DOS, and how when you started working online in a web browser, you had to throw some time at it. When you started working with email, you had to throw some time at it. So this is kind of the same thing, I think.
Yeah, it's clear to me right now that there are things that accountants are doing in Excel, in Power BI, in BI tools in general, in financial reporting tools, many things that you're doing today that are going to be done differently because of MCPs.
Yeah.
So I think the key takeaways that I'd like for you to maybe lock in on, and we encourage you to get involved now rather than later, because you need to begin your learning now. First, that MCPs standardize AI access to accounting systems. It reduces the risk while improving the consistency. And the real work is going to be in your learning and in the governance, not so much the technology. Things like permissions and policies and review procedures are going to actually come into play. And I think MCPs are making AI usable for accountants today, right now, without exporting data or losing control. The MCPs allow that data to stay in your system of record or systems of records. And if you read it out, now you can report on it in ways that you just haven't before. One final twist, which is not MCP, but my vision is that we'll talk to AI and the AI will do the work for us. And you can talk to the models that orchestrate the MCPs. So think about not having to type a query anymore, but to talk a query. Show me all the meals in the past year where I've spent more than $100. Boom. And it just goes and gets that data. In the old days, that'd have been a real pain to do.
Yeah, yeah, it would have been a mess. Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us here at the Technology Lab, folks. We appreciate you spending your time with us. We look forward to seeing you sometime in the future at a future episode of the Accounting Technology Lab. All the best.
Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.